A quiet hospital hallway. A pregnant woman waits with an ultrasound photo in her hand. Then a sudden jealous attack shatters everything as the mistress kicks her in the stomach while the husband watches without helping. They think no one will know. They think they can walk away clean. But the hospital director who arrives at the moment of the emergency is not just anyone. She is the victim's mother, and she is about to expose every second of the truth. What follows is a manhunt, a fight for justice, and a courtroom ending you will never see coming. Tell us what time you are watching and where you are tuning in from. The late afternoon light drifted through the tall windows of Street Aurora Medical Center, spreading a soft golden glow across the quiet hallway of the maternity wing. Julia Bennett stepped out of the examination room with the gentle calm of someone who had just received reassuring news, holding a fresh ultrasound envelope pressed lightly against her chest. Her doctor had smiled at her, whispered that the baby girl was healthy, active, and measuring beautifully for 29 weeks. That simple moment filled Julia with a warm hope that lingered in her eyes as she walked toward the waiting area. She paused beside a long row of chairs, took a slow breath, and reached for her phone. Her voice sounded light, steady, and sweet when she spoke. She told Ethan she had finished her appointment and was ready for him to pick her up. She added a small laugh, the kind a wife gives when everything feels ordinary and safe. He answered quickly, telling her he was nearby and needed only a few minutes to reach her. His tone was casual, almost relaxed, as if nothing in the world carried any shadow. Julia smiled gently at the screen, feeling comfort in the simple fact that her husband would soon be walking toward her. She placed the phone back into her coat pocket and looked down at the ultrasound envelope. The image inside showed her daughter's profile with the tiny nose and the delicate curve of her chin. Julia traced the corner of the envelope with her fingertip, imagining the little kicks she had felt the night before. Imagining the future nursery, imagining Ethan holding their child for the first time. Her heart swelled with an uncomplicated joy that made the entire hallway feel brighter. She straightened her scarf, smoothed her hair, and moved toward the wide open space at the end of the corridor where families usually waited for their loved ones. Nurses pushed carts of medical supplies past her, greeting each other with soft kindness, unaware of the storm that was about to break. Julia remained unaware, too. She stood beside a small indoor plant, her free hand resting gently on her rounded belly, humming a soft tune to herself. Then she heard footsteps, confident ones, echoing ones, the kind that usually signaled her husband approaching with his familiar stride. Julia's heart lifted, and she raised her eyes with a loving smile already forming. But the smile froze before it even completed its shape. Ethan appeared at the far end of the hallway, but he was not alone. Walking beside him, her hand looped casually through the crook of his arm, was Madison Cole. Madison was immaculate in a fitted charcoal suit, her lips curved into a triumphant smirk that carried far more meaning than any words could express. Ethan looked tense, almost startled when his eyes met Julia's. His body stiffened for a split second, yet he did not pull his arm away. Madison leaned slightly into him, her posture bold, her expression confident, as if she had already claimed every part of him that mattered. Julia's mind spun in disbelief, her breath caught in her chest. The ultrasound envelope slipped slightly in her grasp as a tremor moved through her fingers. She took a step forward, whispering his name in a voice that shook with confusion rather than anger. Ethan opened his mouth as if preparing to explain, but Madison tightened her grip on his arm. That small gesture silenced him. He looked down instead of facing his wife fully, and that single moment of hesitation sliced through Julia's heart like a blade. Madison released Ethan's arm and approached Julia with slow, confident steps. Her eyes narrowed as she glanced at the ultrasound envelope clutched protectively against Julia's body. Something dark flashed across her face. A thought, a suspicion, a fear. Madison believed Julia was carrying evidence. She believed the envelope contained documents that could expose the affair, destroy Ethan's career, or ruin certain financial moves she and Ethan had been orchestrating behind closed doors. The idea ignited a dangerous panic inside her. Julia stepped back instinctively, sensing a hostility she could not yet understand. She tried to speak, tried to ask Ethan why Madison was here, tried to find a logical explanation in the chaos spreading around her, but Madison stepped closer, her voice a whisper filled with venom. She accused Julia of planning to expose them. She said Julia always clung to whatever scraps of control she had left. She accused Julia of trapping Ethan with the pregnancy. Her words came sharp and vicious, fueled by jealousy and fear. Julia shook her head, her voice trembling. She tried to explain that the envelope contained nothing more than a routine ultrasound printout, but Madison did not listen. Her emotions spiraled. Her jealousy flared. The pressure inside her built like a tightening coil ready to snap. Madison believed she was moments away from losing everything. She believed Julia held the power to destroy her future. The panic tipped her mind over the edge. Without warning, Madison lashed out. Her foot lifted swiftly, brutally, connecting with Julia's abdomen in a forceful kick that ripped through the hallway like a thunderclap. The sound shattered the stillness. Julia gasped, her entire body folding with the impact as pain exploded across her belly. She crumpled to the cold floor, the ultrasound envelope slipping from her hand and skidding across the polished tiles. A warm rush spread beneath her as the first drops of blood appeared. Ethan froze. He watched his wife collapse, watched her hands clutch desperately at her stomach, watched her eyes widen with terror. For one terrible moment, he did nothing. Madison grabbed his hand, urging him to stay away from Julia. Ethan allowed her to pull him back, even as Julia's blood pooled on the floor. His hesitation became a silent confession of his weakness. Julia managed a broken cry. Nurses turned sharply toward the sound, sprinting across the hall with practiced urgency. Their voices rose in alarm as they knelt beside her, calling for emergency support and signaling a trauma code. One nurse pressed a mask against Julia's face, while another checked for fetal movement. The hallway erupted into shouted instructions and hurried footsteps. Julia's vision blurred. She saw lights trembling overhead. She heard her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She felt the life inside her struggling in fear. Through the haze she saw Ethan, still standing several steps away, his hand entwined with Madison's. The betrayal pierced her deeper than the pain. The world tilted as the nurses lifted her onto a rolling gurney and rushed toward the emergency doors. The last thing Julia tasted before the darkness swallowed her was the metallic sting of fear. The last thing she saw was the ultrasound envelope trembling on the floor. The emergency doors burst open as the nurses pushed Julia's gurney into the brightly lit trauma bay. The harsh white light washed over her pale face while her breath came in shallow, uneven pulls. Blood stained the gown they had quickly placed over her, spreading faster than the nurses wanted to see. An oxygen mask pressed against her mouth and nose as they urged her to breathe steadily, but every inhale sent a sharp pain stabbing through her abdomen. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she tried to hold onto her belly, as if her grip alone could shield her unborn daughter from the violent trauma she had just endured. Voices overlapped above her. One nurse called out Julia's vitals. Another leaned close to adjust the mask. A third reached for the monitor that displayed the baby's heart rate. The steady beep they hoped for was not steady at all. It flickered irregularly, a pattern that tightened the expressions of every medical professional in the room. Julia heard the sound and felt terror crawl through her chest. She tried to lift her head, but the weight of pain pressed her back into the mattress. "Please save my baby." The words barely escaped her, muffled against the oxygen mask, but the nearest nurse heard them. She squeezed Julia's shoulder gently, telling her to stay calm, telling her they were doing everything possible, telling her the baby was still fighting. Julia tried to listen, tried to hold on to the reassurance, but another cramp tore through her stomach. Her fingers clenched at the edges of the blanket as her vision blurred again. She whispered the same plea, desperate and trembling, hoping God or fate or any force capable of mercy would hear her. Outside the trauma bay, Ethan paced with frantic steps. His face had lost all color, and his hands shook as he tried to understand what had just happened. Madison stood beside him with her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her eyes darted toward the emergency doors, then back at Ethan, then toward the nurses, moving quickly through the hallway. Fear settled in her posture, but she fought hard to hide it. When a nurse approached and asked what led to the injury, Madison spoke before Ethan could open his mouth. She claimed Julia slipped, claimed she was dizzy, claimed the fall was nobody's fault. Her voice was strained but firm enough to sound believable. Ethan glanced at Madison, wanting to speak, wanting to correct her, wanting to admit the truth that consumed him with guilt. But Madison reached for his hand. Her grip tightened just enough to force him into silence. Her eyes told him to stay quiet, to protect what little control they still had. Ethan swallowed hard and kept the words locked inside his throat. His silence became a second betrayal, one heavier than the first. Inside the trauma bay, Julia's heart rate accelerated, while the baby's heart rate flickered erratically. The machines beeped in uneven bursts that made the nurses move with even more urgency. One nurse repositioned the fetal monitor, trying to get a clearer reading. Another nurse adjusted the IV line to increase the flow. A doctor stepped in, reviewing the ultrasound scan from earlier that day, using it to compare the current condition of the fetus. The contrast between the calm, healthy image and the present state made his jaw tighten. Julia reached for the doctor's sleeve, gripping it weakly. She whispered again, struggling to push the words out. She tried to say that Madison had kicked her. She tried to say she had been attacked, but her voice failed her halfway through the sentence, swallowed by pain and tears. The doctor leaned closer, trying to catch every sound, but her whisper drifted into nothing as another wave of agony hit. He exchanged a look with the nurses, a silent communication that said they would revisit her statement when she was stable. For now, saving her and the child was the priority. Another contraction rippled across Julia's abdomen. She cried out, her hand reaching blindly toward anyone who could offer comfort. A nurse rushed to her side, holding her hand, speaking softly. She asked Julia to focus on breathing, asked her to stay awake, asked her to trust the team around her. But Julia's eyes fluttered, fighting to stay open. The edges of her vision grew darker every second. Her body felt colder. Her mind drifted between fear and fading consciousness. Out in the hallway, a different tension grew. A younger nurse, who had witnessed the scene moments before, leaned in close to one of her colleagues. She whispered that something about the couple's story felt wrong. She mentioned seeing Julia collapse after a sharp motion from the other woman. Her colleague frowned, listening closely. They could not accuse anyone without evidence, but suspicion lingered between them. They agreed to keep an eye on the situation and inform a supervisor when the time was right. For now, the medical emergency demanded their full attention. Back inside, the fetal monitor shifted again, the beeping slowing for a dangerous second before picking up speed. The doctor cursed under his breath. He ordered more staff into the room. Julia's breathing grew uneven, almost frantic. Her fingers clutched at the bed rails as if she were afraid her body might drift away without her. She begged for her baby in broken whispers. The nurses responded quickly, adjusting medications, repositioning equipment, raising the head of the bed to ease her breathing. A tense quiet settled for a moment, broken only by the rhythmic chaos of the monitors. Julia stared at the ceiling lights as they blurred into streaks of white. She felt another contraction tightening her abdomen and squeezed her eyes shut. She pictured her daughter's silhouette from the ultrasound, the tiny fingers she had traced with her own. That image became her anchor. She held it like a lifeline. Suddenly, the fetal monitor shrieked with a sharper alert. The baby's heart rate plunged in a way that made one nurse gasp and another call for immediate assistance. The doctor stepped forward with firm urgency and told one of the nurses to alert the director. His voice carried a tone that cut through the noise of the trauma bay. He needed authorization for certain emergency measures, and he needed it fast. The nurse ran toward the door at full speed. Julia heard the commotion only faintly, as though she were slipping beneath deep water. Her eyes drifted closed while her hand slid away from the blanket. She wanted to stay awake, but the darkness pressed down harder with every second. The monitor continued its alarming pattern as the medical team worked around her, preparing for the next steps. Outside the trauma bay, Madison tightened her hold on Ethan's hand. Ethan stared at the doors with a haunted expression, knowing something terrible was happening inside. He took a step forward, but Madison pulled him back again. His guilt grew heavier, pressing into his chest until he could hardly breathe. He did nothing to stop the disaster that was unfolding. He stood frozen, drowning in the consequences of his own cowardice. Inside the trauma bay, the doctor stood over Julia, watching the monitor drop again. He raised his voice, demanding immediate authorization. The nurse burst back through the door, calling out for the director with urgent clarity. The room braced for what would come next. The hallway outside the trauma bay felt suspended in a tense, suffocating stillness as Ethan Reeves and Madison Cole stood trapped in the consequences of what had just unfolded. Ethan leaned back against the wall with a hollow stare fixed on the closed emergency doors, his breath shallow and unsteady. His palms were slick with sweat, and he kept rubbing them against his trousers, as if trying to erase the guilt burning across his skin. Madison stood only inches away, her arms locked firmly across her chest like makeshift armor. Her fingers pressed sharply into her elbows, betraying the frantic tremor building beneath her forced composure. She scanned the corridor restlessly, searching for cameras, searching for witnesses, searching for any sign that the truth might be slipping out of her control. She moved closer to Ethan, her voice dropping into a harsh whisper. She repeated the same sentence she had uttered moments earlier. Julia slipped. She repeated it again, slower this time, as though repetition could turn a lie into fact. Julia was dizzy. Julia fell. She shaped each word with the precision of someone sculpting a shield. Ethan swallowed hard and lowered his gaze. He opened his mouth as if ready to correct the story, but Madison seized his hand suddenly. Her grip tightened with a force that carried a command. Ethan felt the warning in her fingers and closed his mouth again, his silence collapsing around him like a failing structure. A nurse emerged from the emergency doors with brisk steps and approached them. Her expression was neutral but tinged with a faint curiosity. She asked what had caused Julia's injury. Madison answered immediately. She claimed Julia lost her balance and fell onto the floor. Her tone was steady, almost matter-of-fact, as if the lie had been practiced long before she ever spoke it. Ethan remained silent, staring at a spot on the floor as if unable to lift his eyes. The nurse watched them both for a long moment, her gaze flicking between their faces. Then she nodded slowly and returned to the trauma bay, though the hesitation in her movement suggested she was not fully convinced. Two other nurses moved down the hallway, whispering to each other as they passed behind Ethan and Madison. Their words were hushed, but the fragments carried enough weight to reach Madison's ears. One said the injury looked too severe for a simple fall. Another mentioned seeing a sudden, sharp motion just before Julia collapsed, though she was not certain of the angle. Their voices faded as they walked away, but the suspicion they left behind hung thick in the air. Madison's spine stiffened. She lifted her chin with a strained confidence that did not match the fear trembling beneath her skin. She turned to Ethan again, her mask of control beginning to crack. She asked him if the nurses believed them. She asked if Julia would wake up and accuse her. She asked what would happen if the truth surfaced. Each question spilled out faster than the last, driven by a rising panic she could no longer fully hide. Ethan remained motionless, still staring at the trauma bay doors as though staring through them. He imagined Julia on the table, imagined the baby's fragile heartbeat struggling to hold on, imagined the consequences of his silence. His guilt pressed against him with relentless weight. Madison brushed a strand of hair behind her ear with an unsteady hand. She insisted that they only needed to stay calm. She insisted that as long as their stories matched, everything would be fine. She insisted that nobody could prove anything without video. Her voice attempted confidence, but the quiver at the end of each sentence betrayed her. Ethan still did not answer. His conscience gnawed at him like a relentless force. He whispered Julia's name under his breath, barely audible, as though reaching for a part of himself that he feared he had already destroyed. From inside the trauma bay came the sharp, accelerating beeps of medical monitors. Ethan stiffened. Madison's eyes widened. More alarms followed, piercing through the hallway. Madison took a step back, dread rising in her expression. She grasped Ethan's arm and demanded to know what they would do if Julia survived. Ethan pulled his arm away and pressed both hands against his forehead. A groan escaped him, a sound filled with remorse and terror. He felt everything collapsing around him, yet still lacked the courage to unravel the lie. A nurse rushed out of the trauma bay carrying additional equipment. She did not approach Ethan or Madison, but her eyes flicked toward them with unmistakable skepticism. She recognized the patterns of violence and the inconsistencies of their story. She offered no accusation, no question, no comment, but her expression said enough. She hurried back inside, leaving Ethan and Madison suspended in the rising tension. Madison moved closer again, lowering her voice until it scraped against desperation. She warned Ethan that everything depended on him staying composed. She reminded him that he would lose everything if he broke down. She whispered that they were in this together. Ethan stepped back, unable to accept her words. His face had drained of all color, and he pressed a trembling hand against the wall to steady himself. Then the atmosphere shifted. Footsteps echoed from the far end of the hallway. They were not rushed like the nurses, nor chaotic like frantic emergencies. These steps were firm and controlled, carrying the weight of authority and purpose. Conversations halted, nurses straightened, orderlies stepped aside. The energy in the hall changed as everyone turned toward the approaching figure. A clear, unwavering voice rang out. "Where is the patient?" Ethan lifted his head. Madison's breath caught. The storm had arrived. Dr. Eleanor Hayes stood directly outside the trauma bay, her presence commanding the full attention of everyone in the hallway. No one had noticed how quickly she crossed the floor after hearing the emergency request, but now that she was here, the atmosphere shifted with undeniable force. She remained perfectly still for a moment, absorbing the intensity of the alarms and the hurried voices drifting from behind the glass. Nurses and assistants instinctively stepped to the side, clearing a path for her as if guided by an unspoken rule. Her face carried a mixture of control and concern, the expression of someone who understood the weight of every second passing inside the room. She approached the doors and stepped through them without hesitation. The medical team looked up, relief flickering across their faces. The attending physician moved toward her immediately, holding a chart and speaking with clear urgency. He reported the rapid drop in fetal heart rate, the significant loss of maternal blood, and the growing instability of Julia Bennett's condition. He stated that the team had reached the limit of their authorization and needed immediate approval for an emergency intervention. Eleanor listened in silence, her eyes fixed on the monitor displaying the erratic heartbeat. Each irregular beep sent a subtle tremor through her chest. She walked toward the table. The bright procedural lights gleamed across Julia's still form. The pale face, the shallow breathing, the strain etched into every small movement made Eleanor stop abruptly. Recognition crashed over her in a single, devastating instant. Her hand lifted involuntarily toward her mask as she tried to steady the wave of shock rising through her. The woman lying there was not simply another patient in critical condition. She was her daughter. She was the child she had planned to embrace again after returning from her long assignment abroad. She had postponed their reunion only to meet her now in the harsh glare of an emergency room filled with fear. Julia stirred faintly. Her lips parted and released a barely audible whisper. The sound was soft and fragile, yet unmistakable. "Mom!" The word pierced the barrier of professional detachment that Eleanor had built over her entire career. For an instant, she felt her knees weaken, and she nearly reached for the side of the bed to steady herself. But the instinct that defined her life rose just as quickly. She pushed the emotion downward, anchoring it behind her resolve. She was both a mother and a physician, and right now the physician needed to lead. She turned toward the attending doctor and spoke clearly. "Proceed. Save both lives. Begin the emergency protocol immediately." Her voice held no tremor, only certainty. The team sprang into motion, energizing the room with renewed purpose. Nurses adjusted monitors. Another prepared the surgical cart. Medications were drawn with swift precision. The once chaotic environment transformed into a coordinated effort driven by Eleanor's authority. She stepped back enough to avoid interfering, yet her eyes never left her daughter. Every shift in the monitor reflected across her emotions, lifting and dropping her heart with each unpredictable reading. Outside the trauma bay, Ethan staggered backward when he heard the nurse refer to Eleanor by name. He pressed a hand to his mouth as the truth consumed him. The director was Julia's mother. The woman he had deceived by silence now stood at the center of the crisis he had helped create. His knees felt weak, and he leaned against the wall to keep himself upright. Fear pulsed through him in sharp waves. His guilt grew heavier with each breath. His mind filled with images of Julia collapsing, of her fragile plea, and of his own cowardice. Madison trembled visibly. Her hand clutched her own wrist as she tried to remain composed. She looked toward the trauma bay with wide, frightened eyes. She whispered to Ethan, asking what they were going to do. Her voice quivered as she told him that the director would learn everything. She insisted they needed to leave, but her legs would not move. The mention of cameras sent a cold shock through her. She imagined the footage playing back in slow motion, capturing every brutal detail. Her stomach twisted with panic. Inside the trauma bay, Eleanor's posture tightened. She continued monitoring the situation. She issued instructions to ensure the team maintained a stable rhythm. She listened to the changes in Julia's breathing. She absorbed each update the nurses offered. Yet even while directing the room with expert clarity, her thoughts drifted painfully toward the months she had spent abroad. She remembered the phone call she had tried to make during her return, the unanswered message she sent in haste, and the plan to reach out again after adjusting her schedule. She had intended to reconnect gently. Instead, fate had delivered this cruel reunion. The physician signaled that preparations were nearly complete. Eleanor took a deep breath, grounding herself. Then she stepped aside to ensure the team had full space to begin. As she glanced through the window in the trauma bay door, her gaze fell directly on Ethan and Madison. Her eyes narrowed slightly, capturing both shock and suspicion. She studied their tense posture, their pale expressions, and the way they hovered anxiously instead of stepping forward. Something about their presence struck her as wrong, a discordant note in the crisis. A nurse approached Eleanor with a tablet containing the preliminary report. She requested confirmation of the protocol. Eleanor signed swiftly, then lowered her voice. "Retrieve all hallway footage from the past hour." She spoke with firm control. The nurse nodded and left to carry out the request. Eleanor looked once more toward the window. Ethan flinched under her gaze. Madison pressed herself against the wall, breathing sharply. Their fear deepened as they realized that the director had noticed them. Eleanor turned back to the medical team. She gave a final nod. The emergency intervention began. The lights shifted. The alarms steadied under adjusted settings. The room filled with steady concentration and rapid movement. Eleanor remained poised, ready to take over if needed. Her heart ached with every fragile breath Julia took, but her resolve only strengthened. Through the window, Ethan watched with a hollow expression. Madison gripped his sleeve, but he shook her off weakly. Inside the trauma bay, Eleanor stood tall, her figure outlined by the harsh lights. Her voice rose once more, calm and controlled. "Save them both." Dr. Eleanor Hayes stepped out of the trauma bay once the emergency procedure reached a controlled stage under the supervision of the attending physician. She moved with sharp, decisive strides, her mind already shifting from medical urgency to the grim responsibility of uncovering the truth. Her daughter was fighting for her life, and the child she carried was hanging by a fragile thread. Someone had caused this. Someone had inflicted violence on a pregnant woman right inside her hospital. The thought tightened Eleanor's chest with a mixture of fury and heartbreak. She refused to let emotion cloud her judgment, but the weight of what she had seen shredded the last remnants of distance between her roles as director and mother. A security officer approached with a tablet, his expression cautious. He informed her that the recordings she requested were ready. Eleanor accepted the device without a word and walked toward a quieter corner of the hallway where the overhead lights reflected softly on the polished floor. She tapped the screen and opened the footage from the corridor outside the examination rooms. The moment the video began playing, she held her breath. The recording showed Julia standing alone, holding her ultrasound envelope with a soft, hopeful expression. A second later, Ethan and Madison entered the frame. Madison's posture radiated tension the moment she saw Julia. Then came the confrontation. The fearful glance from Ethan, the venom in Madison's eyes, the sudden movement, the violent kick that drove directly into Julia's abdomen. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the edges of the tablet as she watched her daughter collapse. She watched the envelope fall. She watched the blood appear. She watched her daughter's body fold in agony, while the father of her unborn grandchild did nothing to help. Her stomach twisted with grief and rage. She forced herself to keep watching, documenting every detail. She noted the trajectory of Madison's attack, the way Ethan froze, and the exact moment Julia hit the floor. The video captured it all with unforgiving clarity. Eleanor paused the frame on the moment Julia fell. She closed her eyes for a full second, gathering strength while fighting the urge to let her heartbreak surface. When she opened her eyes again, her expression had transformed into something colder and sharper. She turned to the security officer. Her voice was low and controlled. "Make sure every file is backed up and protected." The officer nodded quickly and assured her that the footage had been copied and stored in multiple secure locations. Eleanor returned the tablet and ordered a duplicate sent directly to her office. She inhaled slowly, then faced the hallway again. Ethan and Madison stood several feet away, pale and tense. They exchanged frantic whispers, their eyes darting toward the trauma bay, then toward the exits, then toward each other. They froze when they saw Eleanor approaching. Her posture was deceptively calm as she walked toward them. Every step carried the precision of someone who had made a final decision. She stopped in front of Ethan first. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His throat tightened under the weight of her stare. She asked one question, quiet and unyielding. "Did your wife fall on her own?" Ethan swallowed hard. His lips trembled. He tried to speak, but guilt crushed his voice. He could only manage a shallow shake of his head. Madison stepped forward quickly, forcing a weak smile. She insisted that Julia slipped. She insisted that everything had happened too fast. She insisted that no one meant any harm. Her voice wavered with each excuse. Eleanor did not look at her. Instead, she kept her eyes locked on Ethan. She repeated the question. His silence answered for him. Madison's face shifted from attempted confidence to exposed fear. She reached for Ethan's arm, but he stepped back, unable to bear the sight of the woman who had destroyed everything. He whispered Julia's name under his breath, a faint plea that made Madison's mask crumble further. Eleanor turned to the nearest nurse and issued instructions with unwavering authority. Initiate the patient assault protocol, contact hospital security, and prepare a full report for law enforcement. Seal this hallway and make sure neither of these individuals leaves the building. The nurse nodded and hurried away to carry out the commands. The security officer stepped to Eleanor's side, already preparing to place the area under restricted access. Madison's breath quickened. She asked whether this was necessary. She said Julia would be fine. She insisted that calling the police was an overreaction. Her voice grew thinner as she spoke. Eleanor stepped toward her, and Madison pressed herself backward until she met the wall. Eleanor's eyes held fire behind their calm surface. A mother's grief, a director's resolve. She spoke softly, and the softness made the words more terrifying. A pregnant woman did not attack herself. Ethan lowered his head. His shoulders shook. Madison's lips parted, but no words followed. The hallway seemed to close in around them, pressing their guilt into the open air. The presence of nurses and staff nearby only heightened the weight of the moment. Every pair of eyes reflected judgment. Every silence cut deeper. Eleanor turned away from them. She had no interest in their excuses. She had already seen the truth with her own eyes. As she stepped toward the trauma bay doors, a nurse ran toward her with heightened urgency. "The baby's heart rate is dropping again. We need you inside." Eleanor pivoted instantly, her worry returning with full force. Without another glance at Ethan or Madison, she pushed through the doors and disappeared into the bright, frantic light of the trauma bay. The real battle was far from over. Dr. Eleanor Hayes rushed back into the trauma bay the moment she heard the alarming drop in the fetal heart rate. The monitor filled the room with a frantic pattern of shrill beeping that rose and fell like a desperate cry. The attending physician looked up sharply as she entered, relief and urgency blending in his expression. He reported that the baby's heart rate had plummeted again and that the mother's blood pressure had begun to fall as well. Eleanor moved closer to the table, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She steadied herself with a deep breath, then pulled on a new pair of sterile gloves with swift, practiced movements. The team tightened their focus as she approached. The lights above the bed cast a bright glow over Julia's still form. Her face appeared even paler under the harsh illumination. Her breathing grew more shallow, strained by the weight of pain and shock. Eleanor stepped beside the attending physician and studied the monitor. The pattern flashed irregular spikes that dipped dangerously low, every drop pulled at her chest like a hand closing around her heart. Yet she kept her voice steady. The physician listed the available options. They could try adjusting medications. They could attempt to stabilize the heartbeat with targeted interventions. Or they could proceed with an emergency delivery if the situation worsened. He explained each option carefully, but the tension in his shoulders showed that time was slipping through their fingers. Eleanor looked at Julia, then at the monitor, then at the physician. She weighed the risks quickly, her mind shifting between clinical logic and maternal fear. The room waited for her call. She issued immediate instructions to adjust the medications and stabilize the mother's blood pressure. Nurses moved swiftly, adjusting the IV line, preparing additional supplies, and repositioning the fetal monitor. The team worked with fierce concentration, but the baby's heart rate continued to flicker. Eleanor leaned closer to the table. She touched Julia's hand gently, careful not to disturb the equipment. Julia's fingers twitched faintly in response. The slight movement intensified the ache inside Eleanor, yet strengthened her resolve. Outside the trauma bay, the atmosphere vibrated with rising panic. Ethan stood frozen, unable to look away from the closed doors. The muffled alarms seeped through the walls, stabbing at his conscience. His hands shook uncontrollably. His face had lost all color, and his breath came in short, uneven bursts. He whispered Julia's name under his breath, each repetition filled with regret. He feared the possibility that she might not survive. He feared losing the child he had barely acknowledged. He feared the truth burning through the thin wall separating him from the woman he had betrayed. Madison clung to the wall with trembling hands. The sharp sounds of the monitors from inside the room made her vision blur with dread. She imagined Julia dying. She imagined the consequences of a death that would expose her attack as the cause. She begged Ethan to say something. She begged him to help her. She begged him to do anything that might delay the inevitable. Ethan barely responded. His guilt suffocated him. Hospital security positioned themselves several steps away, their expressions firm. One stood guard at the exit. Another approached Ethan and Madison and asked for identification. Ethan handed over his documents with a trembling hand. Madison fumbled through her purse, her fingers slipping against the zipper as fear clouded her thoughts. The officer wrote down their names and collected additional details. Ethan felt his heart sink as he realized the hallway had closed around them like a cage. Back inside the trauma bay, the medical team worked with renewed intensity. The attending physician glanced at the monitor and murmured that the adjustments were not helping. The baby's heart rate dipped again. The beeping slowed, then fluttered weakly. Eleanor exhaled sharply. She felt her chest tighten as she looked at the falling numbers. She knew what needed to happen. She nodded to the physician, who waited for her confirmation. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice filled with controlled urgency. "Prepare for an emergency delivery." The team responded immediately. The lights changed to surgical mode. Additional carts rolled into position. The anesthesiologist stepped closer to make adjustments. A nurse moved swiftly to secure Julia's oxygen supply. The room tightened around its center, every movement synchronized with practiced precision and rising tension. Julia moaned weakly as her body reacted to the shifting preparations. Eleanor leaned in, whispering gently that help was here, that she was not alone, that they would save her and the baby. The words trembled in her throat, but she spoke them with the confidence of someone who refused to give up. Julia's eyelids flickered, though she did not fully regain consciousness. The small response sent another jolt of hope through Eleanor's chest. Outside, Ethan pressed his palms to the window of the trauma bay door, trying to see through the narrow gap. He caught glimpses of blurred figures and bright lights. He felt helpless and terrified. Madison stood several steps behind him, her back rigid, her eyes wide with panic. She hugged herself tightly, whispering to no one in particular that this was not supposed to happen. The words fell flat in the cold hallway. Security moved closer. The guard near the exit shifted his stance, signaling that neither of them would be allowed to leave. Ethan realized he was trapped not only physically but morally. His silence had pushed everything into darkness. His inaction had nearly cost 2 lives. Inside the trauma bay, the attending physician announced that they were losing the heartbeat again. Time had run out. Eleanor straightened her shoulders. Her expression sharpened with fierce resolve. "Begin the procedure." The team launched into action. The surgical lights brightened. The instruments clattered softly as they were arranged. The anesthesiologist prepared the necessary adjustments. The nurse positioned the emergency tray. The room became a chamber of rapid, precise motion. A nurse rushed to the door to relay urgent information to the hallway staff. Her voice carried high tension. "If the baby does not respond in the next minute, we proceed fully." Ethan nearly collapsed at the words. Madison covered her mouth. Security remained still, watching them carefully. The trauma bay doors closed fully. The world outside fell silent. The fight for 2 lives had begun. The harsh brightness of the surgical lights softened as the emergency procedure finally reached its critical turning point. The chaos that had dominated the trauma bay only minutes earlier began to settle into a steadier rhythm. Voices that had once been sharp with urgency now moved with controlled concentration. After what felt like an eternity, the pediatric team stepped forward to assist with the final stage of the emergency delivery. A faint cry pierced the air, thin but unmistakably alive. The sound washed through the room like a fragile beam of light cutting through a storm. For a moment, every person present seemed to exhale at once. The newborn was lifted gently, wrapped in a warm towel, and carried to the neonatal team waiting nearby. They moved quickly to clean, assess, and stabilize the tiny infant whose life had hung on a thread only moments earlier. The cry grew steadier as the baby responded to the medical attention. It was not loud, but it was strong enough to fill the room with a sense of victory. Eleanor pressed one hand against her chest while the other steadied her breath. She had prepared herself for the worst. She had forced herself to remain composed. But the sound of her granddaughter alive brought a rush of relief so powerful it nearly weakened her knees. Once the baby was secured and taken to the adjacent neonatal suite, the team shifted their attention fully to Julia. Her blood pressure began to rise slowly. Her breathing steadied with the help of the ventilatory support. The color on her face remained pale, but the dangerous downward spiral had halted. Eleanor stood beside her daughter's bed with her gloved hands resting lightly on the rail, watching the numbers on the monitor climb into safer territory. The attending physician announced that the crisis had passed. They would continue to monitor for complications. But for now, mother and child had survived. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, letting the relief sink in but refusing to collapse under the weight of her emotions. After a long moment, she removed her gloves, disposed of them, and stepped aside while the nurses cleaned the area and prepared Julia for transfer to recovery. She followed the moving bed as they pushed her daughter through the doors and down the hallway. The adrenaline still coursed through her veins, but her mind was already shifting to the next battle: justice, accountability, truth. Those words pulsed violently through every thought. In the recovery room, the lights were dimmer. The machines hummed softly. Julia lay still beneath a warm blanket. Her breathing was shallow but stable. Eleanor took a seat beside the bed and held her daughter's hand. She waited. Time moved slowly. After several minutes, Julia stirred. Her eyelids fluttered with effort. A soft sound slipped past her lips, fragile yet purposeful. Eleanor leaned closer, whispering gently that she was safe. She told her the baby was alive. She told her she was no longer in danger. Julia's eyes opened fully, filled with confusion before recognition slowly returned. She asked about the baby in a hoarse whisper. Eleanor smiled through teary eyes and told her the infant was in the neonatal room, strong enough to cry and breathe without assistance. Julia's lips trembled with relief, but her expression changed abruptly as memory rushed back. A shadow crossed her face. She whispered that Madison had kicked her. The words were faint but sharp with truth. Eleanor nodded, her expression growing stern. She told Julia that she had already seen the camera footage. She told her the evidence was undeniable. Julia's eyes widened with shaken disbelief, even though she had known what happened. Somehow, hearing it confirmed by her mother, the director of the hospital, made the reality even heavier. Julia looked down at her trembling hands, gathering courage before meeting her mother's gaze. She whispered that she wanted to make a formal statement. Eleanor felt a surge of pride mixed with sorrow. Julia was weak, exhausted, and still in pain, yet her resolve stood firm. A nurse entered the room to check the machines, and Eleanor asked her to send hospital security and a reporting staff member. Within minutes, a clipboard and recorder were brought in. The security officer and reporting nurse stood respectfully near the foot of the bed. Julia straightened slightly, gathering every ounce of strength she had left. She recounted the events clearly. She explained where she stood. She described Madison's approach. She described the deliberate movement, the impact, the pain. She described Ethan's silence. Her voice trembled at moments, but she never backed away from the truth. Every detail she gave aligned perfectly with the camera footage Eleanor had watched earlier. The reporting nurse typed quickly, her face tightening with outrage as the story unfolded. Outside the room, Ethan sat hunched over with his head buried in his hands. He had heard that Julia survived. He had heard the baby lived. But instead of relief, he felt a crushing mixture of shame and dread. He knew that the moment Julia woke up, everything would unravel. Madison paced the hallway, her steps quick and erratic. Her breath came in short bursts as panic clawed at her throat. She whispered to herself that Julia might not remember. She whispered that maybe the police would not believe the story. She whispered anything that could soften the overwhelming terror. But the truth was already spilling out in the recovery room. Eleanor stepped to the doorway when the statement was finished. She looked directly at the security officer and spoke with a resolve that left no room for doubt. The officer nodded. The next steps were clear. Ethan lifted his head slowly and saw the expression on Eleanor's face. He understood instantly. Madison stopped pacing the moment the officer approached her. Her eyes widened, her voice cracked with fear. Ethan could not find the strength to move. Inside the room, Julia closed her eyes again, exhausted but unbroken. Her daughter was alive. She herself had survived. And now she had spoken the truth aloud. It was time for justice to begin. 2 uniformed officers arrived at the hospital less than an hour after Julia's emergency delivery. They entered through the main entrance with clear purpose, carrying the freshly approved emergency arrest warrant in a sealed folder. Their radios crackled with status updates as they walked through the halls. They had been instructed to take Ethan Caldwell and Madison Price into custody immediately. The evidence was overwhelming. The camera footage, the medical report, and Julia's sworn statement had been received and reviewed. The case had officially crossed into the category of violent assault on a pregnant woman. The officers reached the security desk near the trauma wing. Hospital security provided printed copies of the hallway footage and the physician's documentation confirming the severity of Julia's injuries. One officer reviewed the images quickly and nodded. Everything matched the report. They asked where Ethan and Madison were being held. The head of hospital security gestured toward the corridor outside the trauma bay, explaining that both individuals had been instructed to remain in the area earlier. The officers thanked him and moved down the hallway with steady strides. But when they turned the corner, the hallway was empty. The chairs near the wall were vacant. The spot where Ethan had been sitting during the surgery was abandoned. Madison was nowhere in sight. The officers exchanged a quick glance before questioning a nearby nurse. She explained that during the height of the emergency alarms, the 2 individuals had slipped away unnoticed. The officers immediately checked the nearest exits. A security guard confirmed that a rear service door had been triggered earlier. But the alert had been ignored because every staff member had been focused on the crisis in the operating room. One officer contacted dispatch to report the escape. The message traveled through the police network within seconds. The watch commander upgraded the situation to a citywide alert. A second alert followed, marking both suspects as actively fleeing. Officers across the metropolitan area received the updated notice. Patrol cars were instructed to monitor highways, bus stations, and airports. The silver sedan belonging to Ethan Caldwell was entered into the license plate recognition system. Every police cruiser in the area was updated. Inside the hospital, Eleanor stood with her arms crossed near the recovery room door as the officers briefed her on the situation. She listened without interruption. Her face remained calm, but her eyes carried a quiet intensity that unsettled even the seasoned officers. She thanked them for their work and insisted that the search continue without delay. When they asked whether she wanted to add anything to the report, she spoke in a low, steady voice. She said the attack had nearly killed her daughter and her granddaughter. She said the suspects had shown no remorse. She said the law must follow them wherever they tried to run. The officers assured her that the search was fully underway. While Julia rested in the recovery room, police units spread across the city. The silver sedan was spotted on a traffic camera heading south toward a commercial district. Minutes later, detectives located footage from an ATM where Ethan had withdrawn a large sum of cash. Another camera showed Madison at a convenience store, buying sunglasses and a dark cap. Her hands shook as she handed money to the clerk. Her attempt at disguise was clumsy, but it confirmed their intention. They were preparing to disappear. A patrol unit eventually spotted the silver sedan near the highway, leading toward the international airport. The vehicle accelerated, weaving through traffic before taking the exit toward the terminal roads. The patrol car followed at a safe distance while reporting the direction of travel. Additional units redirected to intercept. The sedan entered the airport parking structure and disappeared among the rows of vehicles. Inside the airport, Ethan and Madison moved with hurried steps disguised as casual travel. The bright overhead lights cast long shadows as they blended into the flow of passengers dragging luggage toward the check-in counters. Madison clung to Ethan's arm, her sunglasses hiding most of her face. She whispered nervously that they needed to hurry. Ethan did not respond. His expression was blank and hollow. He approached a self-service kiosk and purchased 2 tickets using false identification. The machine printed the boarding passes, and he handed one to Madison with a shaking hand. She clutched it tightly, whispering that they only needed to get past security. But the airport surveillance team had already been alerted. A technician monitoring the cameras recognized the suspects and notified the officers who were approaching through Terminal B. Police formed a coordinated approach from 3 directions. One team advanced through the main doors, another moved through the internal service hallway, a third waited near the baggage screening area. Their radios clicked with synchronized instructions. Ethan and Madison reached the security line. The air hummed with airport chatter and rolling luggage. Madison nudged Ethan and whispered that she saw uniforms behind them. Ethan turned his head slightly and caught sight of officers moving with determined steps. His breath tightened. He tried to push forward, but he had no space to run. Madison's panic broke through her thin mask of composure. She dropped her boarding pass and grabbed Ethan's sleeve, urging him to do something, anything. But there was nothing left to do. 5 officers closed around them. The commanding officer ordered Madison to place her hands behind her back. Madison screamed that it had been an accident. She insisted that she had not meant to hurt anyone. Her voice echoed through the terminal, drawing the attention of nearby travelers. Phones were raised as bystanders recorded the scene. Tears streamed down Madison's face as the cuffs clicked around her wrists. Ethan did not resist. He lowered his head as the officer approached him. He extended his hands without being asked. His voice emerged in a broken whisper. He wanted to know whether Julia was alive. The officer answered truthfully. She survived, and she spoke clearly. Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes filling with a sorrow that came too late. The officers escorted both suspects outside through the sliding doors and placed them into waiting patrol vehicles. Red and blue lights reflected off the airport windows. Reporters who had gathered near the terminal captured the moment the doors shut behind the arrested pair. Passengers stared as the cars pulled away, carrying the 2 fugitives back into custody. At the hospital, an officer called Eleanor with the news. She listened silently and finally allowed herself a long breath. Justice had taken another step forward, and the path toward the courtroom was now fully open. Ethan Caldwell and Madison Price were transported to the Federal Detention Center shortly after their capture at the airport. The ride to the holding facility was silent except for the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the officers' radios. Neither suspect attempted to speak. Madison stared out the barred window with trembling hands. Ethan kept his head lowered, trying to steady his breath, as the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on him. When they arrived, officers escorted them through the steel doors and into separate intake rooms. Their fingerprints were taken, their belongings were catalogued. Their phones, wallets, and jewelry were sealed in numbered evidence bags. They were then escorted to separate holding cells to await the first round of questioning. The interrogation rooms were brightly lit, furnished with only a metal table and 2 chairs. Madison was brought in first. A female detective entered and set a recorder on the table. She informed Madison that the session would be recorded and that she had the right to remain silent. Madison immediately launched into a frantic explanation. She claimed everything was a misunderstanding. She insisted she had only acted because she was scared. She tried to blame Ethan, saying he had convinced her that Julia was threatening their future. The detective listened without changing her expression. She reminded Madison that the camera footage captured the entire assault clearly and that multiple witnesses confirmed Julia had not acted aggressively at any point. Madison's voice grew louder as she realized her excuses were falling apart. She begged for leniency, but the detective simply noted her statements and ended the session. Ethan's interrogation followed. The detective assigned to his case entered quietly, placed the recorder on the table, and informed him of his rights. Ethan did not speak for several long moments. When he finally lifted his head, his face carried a hollow resignation. He admitted he should have stopped Madison. He admitted he had seen the fear in Julia's eyes. He admitted he had allowed himself to freeze instead of stepping in. The detective asked him whether he understood the severity of the injuries. Ethan nodded slowly. He said he did not want Julia or the baby to die. His voice cracked when he heard himself say the word baby. The detective made no commentary. He simply gathered the statements and concluded the session. Meanwhile, news of the arrest spread across the city. The morning broadcasts replayed the camera footage from the hospital hallway. Commentators discussed the brutality of the attack and the danger Julia and her unborn child had faced. The public reaction was immediate and fierce. Ethan's financial firm released a statement hours later announcing his permanent removal from the board. Investors withdrew funds in large numbers. Stock values plummeted. Longtime partners issued public condemnations, distancing themselves from his actions. Madison also faced fallout. The public relations company she worked for terminated her employment. Her social media accounts were flooded with outrage. Neighbors and extended family refused to comment when approached by reporters. Inside the hospital, Julia watched the news from her recovery bed. Eleanor sat beside her, holding her hand while the television displayed headlines about the assault and the arrest. Julia's face remained composed, though her eyes carried a heavy sadness. She did not celebrate the downfall of Ethan and Madison. She only whispered that she wanted the truth to be acknowledged. Eleanor squeezed her hand gently and told her that the process was moving forward. She reminded Julia that her courage in giving a statement had helped the case take shape. Later that afternoon, 2 federal prosecutors arrived at the hospital to meet with Julia. They thanked her for her bravery and explained the next steps of the investigation. They asked for clarification on several details from her earlier statement. Julia answered each question with quiet determination. The prosecutors showed her the compiled evidence. She saw the annotated timeline of the incident, the still images from the camera footage, and the medical report describing the severity of the trauma. When they asked if she was willing to testify in court when the time came, Julia nodded. She wanted to ensure her daughter would grow up knowing the truth had been defended. Back at the detention center, Ethan and Madison were held in separate cells. Madison paced back and forth, her breathing shallow, as she stared at the concrete floor. She shouted occasionally, asking for her lawyer, asking for someone to help her, asking when she would be allowed to go home. No answer comforted her. Ethan sat on the edge of his cot with his elbows on his knees, his hands covering his face. He whispered that he should have protected Julia. He whispered that he could never undo what had happened. The weight of his choices settled on him with full force. Madison's cries from the neighboring wing echoed faintly through the corridors, but Ethan did not respond. He remained in silent collapse. By evening, the prosecutors finished assembling the official case file. They had Julia's statement, the medical testimony, the security footage, and the recorded interrogations. The forensic report from the emergency room confirmed that the impact to Julia's abdomen had placed both her and her unborn child in life-threatening danger. The prosecutors reviewed every document and signed the order to move the case forward. The charges would be presented to the court at the earliest available session. Eleanor received a call from the prosecution team shortly before midnight. They informed her that the case had been formally approved for trial. She stepped to the window of the hospital room and looked out at the city lights. Her daughter slept peacefully in the bed behind her. Eleanor felt a long, slow breath escape her chest. The fight was not finished, but an important battle had been won. She returned to Julia's side, letting her fingers gently brush the back of her daughter's hand. The following morning, a transport vehicle rolled through the secured entrance of the federal courthouse. Reporters had gathered near the barriers, cameras ready. The sun had just risen, casting a golden light across the steps of the building. Officers escorted Madison and Ethan from the vehicle. Their wrists were cuffed. Their expressions carried fear, exhaustion, and defeat. Flashes erupted as journalists captured the moment. Madison tried to hide her face. Ethan kept his eyes on the ground. Officers guided them through the entrance and into the long hallway that led toward the courtroom. The doors closed behind them, marking the beginning of the next phase. The trial was about to begin. The federal courthouse filled before sunrise on the morning of the hearing. Reporters lined the sidewalks with cameras raised toward the steps. Elderly couples arrived together, carrying small thermoses of coffee as they waited for the doors to open. Many of them had followed the story from the moment the footage became public, and they believed the case represented something larger than a single assault. It had become a symbol of the strength of a mother who fought for her child and the resilience of a woman who refused to break under cruelty. Security officers stood at every entrance, guiding the crowd into organized lines. Inside the building, the courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as observers settled into their seats. The judge had ordered strict silence once proceedings began, but for now, the room carried the weight of anticipation. When Julia arrived, the atmosphere changed instantly. She entered slowly, supported by Eleanor, who walked beside her with steady composure. Julia moved carefully, her steps deliberate, the lingering weakness from her trauma still visible. A nurse pushed a small bassinet beside them. Inside, her newborn daughter slept beneath a soft blanket. The sight of mother and child caused the entire courtroom to fall quiet. People rose to their feet instinctively, not out of obligation but out of sheer respect. Even the judge, seated at the bench, paused for a moment before signaling for Julia to be seated. The courtroom had seen many tragedies, but the presence of a woman who had survived both violence and surgery brought an undeniable emotional weight. Once everyone was seated, the prosecution began presenting the key evidence that had built the case. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as a screen lowered on the side wall. The familiar security footage played. It showed Julia standing alone in the hallway. It showed Madison approaching with cold anger. It showed the brutal kick. It showed Julia collapsing. As the audio picked up Julia's faint cry, several people in the gallery covered their mouths. Elderly viewers watched with glistening eyes, murmuring prayers under their breath. The footage continued with the moment Ethan stepped back instead of helping. Every detail was clear and impossible to dispute. Next, the audio of the interrogations played. Madison's frantic voice spilled through the speakers as she tried to shift blame. Ethan's quiet confession followed. His voice cracked as he admitted he had failed to protect his wife and their unborn child. The courtroom listened in silence. When the recording stopped, the judge looked somber. The truth had been presented with stark clarity. Julia was then called to the stand. Eleanor helped her rise, and the courtroom watched her with deep empathy. Julia placed her hand on the rail for support before beginning. Her voice trembled slightly, but her words were firm. She described the day of the attack. She explained how she had wanted to surprise Ethan with the ultrasound envelope. She explained how Madison confronted her, how fear shot through her body, how the pain overwhelmed her when she fell. She spoke about thinking she would lose her baby. She paused as she glanced down at her daughter. Her next words reached every corner of the room. She said she had found strength because she refused to let her child's life end on a cold hospital floor. Her testimony drew tears from the gallery. When Julia stepped down, the judge allowed Eleanor to speak in her role as both mother and hospital director. Eleanor walked to the front calmly, her voice held steady, yet every word carried depth. She explained the emergency procedure, the dangerous drop in Julia's blood pressure, and the near loss of the infant. She paused, and the room leaned in closer. Then she said the sentence that quieted even the clicking cameras of the press. She said that if her daughter had died that night, she would have died with her. The room froze in absolute silence. Even the defense attorneys lowered their eyes. Ethan's shoulders shook as he sat at the defense table. Madison began crying, her breath catching as she held her head in her hand. The prosecution then delivered its closing statement. The prosecutor walked slowly before the jury, outlining each charge with precise clarity. He emphasized the brutality of the assault, the conscious decision to harm a pregnant woman, the danger inflicted on an unborn child, and the attempt to flee the country after the crime. He reminded the jury that silence in the face of violence was also an act of harm. He asked the court to choose the maximum sentencing available under federal law, not out of vengeance, but out of respect for the life that had been threatened and for the justice owed to Julia and her daughter. The defense attempted a final argument, but it carried little weight. The evidence was overwhelming. The courtroom understood the truth long before the defense finished speaking. After brief deliberation, the jury returned to the room. The judge asked whether they had reached a verdict. The four persons stood and announced their decision. Madison was found guilty of assault, causing severe bodily harm, endangering the life of a fetus, and attempting to evade law enforcement. Ethan was found guilty of complicity, failure to intervene, and attempting to flee the jurisdiction. The judge read the sentencing with firm authority. Madison received a lengthy prison term for her direct act of violence. Ethan received several years for his role and for abandoning his responsibility. The bailiff stepped forward and placed handcuffs on both of them. Madison's cries echoed as she was taken away. Ethan bowed his head and walked without resistance. The courtroom exhaled as justice landed with finality. When it was over, Eleanor returned to Julia's side. Julia lifted her daughter into her arms. Tears filled her eyes, not from pain but from release. The long night that had nearly taken everything from her was finally behind her. The courtroom doors opened and sunlight spread across the hall. Eleanor guided her daughter forward. Together, they stepped outside where cameras flashed and reporters called their names. Julia held her daughter close and whispered that they had made it. Eleanor placed a hand on her back and told her she had fought with courage. The story closed not with darkness, but with light, carried in the small heartbeat of a child who had survived.